Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new study. Today, we are diving deep into the fascinating and honestly highly charged theological arguments and debate tactics of Christian apologist Sam Shamoun. We are sourcing this directly from the Towards Jesus YouTube channel, and real quick, you'll find a link to the original source videos right down below this one. What we're presenting today is a full summary of these extensive dialogues, and let me tell you, what makes this source material so incredibly gripping are the massive emotional stakes involved. I mean, these aren't just your standard dry academic lectures. We're talking about live, unscripted calls with real people who are actively wrestling with the fate of their eternity. You've got ex-members of other faiths desperately looking for answers, and folks just trying to figure out how to reconcile ancient doctrines with a modern worldview. So we're going to examine all of this strictly as an impartial study, observing exactly how these deeply complex religious questions are navigated in real time. Let's get into it.
Here is the roadmap for our study today. We're breaking this down into 5 key parts. 1. Defining the triune God. 2. Church continuity and unity. 3. Challenging Eastern theologies. 4. Divine justice and atonement. And 5. The afterlife perspective.
All right, starting right off with Section 1, defining the triune God and the nature of the divine.
To kick things off, the source features this highly relatable, really interesting conversation with a caller from Myanmar. He's a former Buddhist, and he is trying to figure out how on earth to explain the Christian God to teenagers who are, totally obsessed with video games like Fortnite. It's an earnest attempt, right? He suggests a modern metaphor. What if we teach the kids that God the Father is the main player sitting at the console, who then uses the Holy Spirit, kind of like an internet connection, to play Jesus as an avatar or a character on the screen? Well, Shamoun firmly, and I mean firmly, rejects this approach. He immediately categorizes it as an ancient theological heresy known as modalism. He visually contrasts this idea, the concept that God is just one single person wearing different masks or operating in different modes, with the Orthodox Trinity. The Orthodox view, as he explains it, asserts that God is one single divine nature that is simultaneously and eternally shared by 3 entirely distinct, co-equal persons. Now, to make this incredibly complex concept of one nature, multiple persons accessible, without falling back on flawed tech metaphors, Shamoun deploys this vivid, real-world analogy. It's actually brilliant. He brings up the legendary heavyweight boxer George Foreman. If you know anything about Foreman, you probably know he had 12 children, including 5 sons, and he famously named every single one of those sons George. Literally George Jr., George III, George IV, the whole shebang. Shamoun uses this to hit the nail on the head regarding the critical distinction between what someone is, their nature, and who someone is, their distinct personhood. Just as a human father can have multiple distinct sons who all share the exact same human nature and the exact same family name, Shamoun argues that multiple distinct persons can share a single divine nature without breaking any rules of logic. They are absolutely distinct individual persons with unique identities, but they seamlessly share the exact same essence. Building on that, Shamoun really pushes back against this idea that the distinct persons of the Trinity are locked in some sort of cosmic competition for supremacy. Instead, he describes the Godhead as this mutually adoring, completely unified family. For instance, he points to biblical texts showing the Father willfully entrusting all judgment to the Son, specifically in order to honor him. And the Holy Spirit? His role is to act specifically to glorify the Son, never drawing attention to himself. To give this dynamic some real dramatic weight, Shamoun highlights a scriptural point about the unforgivable sin. He points out that Jesus, the Son, explicitly states he will readily forgive blasphemies and insults directed against himself, but he fiercely protects the Holy Spirit, warning that blasphemy against the Spirit will never be forgiven. So the source presents this internal dynamic not as some confusing bureaucratic hierarchy, but as the ultimate eternal model of perfect selfless love that humans are actually meant to emulate. Moving right along to Section 2, Church Continuity and Unity and Historical Traces. Here we get into a really intense dialogue where Shamoun is advising a former Jehovah's Witness on how to effectively debate current members of that group. And the source relies heavily on a strict, unyielding, historical timeline. See, the caller expresses this deep, lingering anxiety over the Jehovah's Witnesses' claim that they, and they alone, possess this unique global unity. Shamoun counters that anxiety directly by pointing to ancient churches, specifically the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox, and Assyrian churches. He argues that these institutions trace their roots directly back to the 1st century. He draws a sharp, undeniable contrast on this historical timeline, noting that the Jehovah's Witnesses only popped up on the scene in the late 19th century under a man named Charles Taze Russell. Shamoun uses this rhetorical pacing to really drive the point home for the caller. He's essentially asking them to chew on the massive implications of that timeline. I mean, think about it. If the true church didn't even exist until the late 1800s, did God simply abandon humanity and fail to preserve his church for over 1700 years? The really crucial point Shamoun makes here is that true global unity just isn't an exclusive feature of modern religious organizations. He advises the caller to investigate these ancient churches to see real historical unity in action. Let's do a quick thought experiment. Imagine walking into a grand cathedral in Rome, and then, the very next week, walking into a small parish in rural India. According to the source, you'd experience the exact same scriptural readings, the exact same liturgical calendar, and the exact same Mass. Shamoun argues that modern groups only appear uniquely united if your sole point of comparison is the heavily fragmented landscape of modern Protestant denominations. When you zoom out, when you look at the massive, uniform, global structure of the ancient historical churches, he argues that the modern claim of exclusive unity just completely falls apart.
Okay, jumping into Section 3, Challenging Eastern Theologies, focusing on reincarnation and texts. Now, the debate tactics used in this particular dialogue are remarkably direct and, honestly, highly combative. Shamoun challenges a Hindu caller's belief in karma and reincarnation by relentlessly pressing him on the absolute logical extremes of the rebirth cycle. He aggressively questions the caller, literally forcing him to confirm a cycle where an ancestor, or, hey, even the caller himself in a past life, could sequentially transform from a cockroach into a pig, into a human being, and then potentially regress back into an animal like a rat, a cow, or a gorilla. Shamoun just refuses to let the caller pivot away from this. He repeatedly demands a simple yes or no, these highly specific biological transitions. He forces the caller to publicly agree to these possibilities right there on the live stream. It's a strategy meant to rhetorically undermine the appeal of the theology, highlighting what Shamoun views as the sheer absurdity of applying the mechanics of biological evolution to spiritual reincarnation.
And then, the heated conversation shifts gears to focus on the historical reliability of religious texts. The Hindu caller attempts to prove that the Vedas, which are the ancient Hindu scriptures, are over 14,000 years old. To back this up, he cites these incredibly complex astrophysical calculations based on the ancient alignment of stars in Orion's belt that are mentioned in the texts. But Shamoun swiftly and masterfully neutralizes this claim. He completely pivots the debate away from the stars in the sky, bringing it right back down to earthly physical manuscript evidence. He flat out asks the caller to produce physical copies of the Vedas from that era. And when the caller obviously cannot, Shamoun contrasts that complete lack of ancient physical Vedic manuscripts with the immense tangible textual backing of the Christian New Testament. He essentially changes the entire metric of the debate, demanding hard, physical proof over astronomical theories.
And that brings us to this specific number, 25,000. In the context of ancient history, this figure is absolutely staggering. To put that into perspective, when historians evaluate ancient historical documents, they're often relying on just a handful of manuscript copies. We're talking maybe 10 or 20 surviving copies for the writings of Julius Caesar, or maybe a few hundred for Homer's Iliad, and even those were often copied centuries after the original events took place. But Shamoun heavily emphasizes this massive number, 25,000, representing the sheer volume of New Testament manuscript copies available across various ancient languages. And he points out that some of these physical fragments date to within mere decades of the original writings. He wields this number as a definitive trump card, asserting that the Christian New Testament is undeniably the best preserved document in all of antiquity, and he demands that any competing religious text provide an equal level of historical proof. All right, let's look at Section 4, Divine Justice and Atonement and the Moral Law.
This next section tackles a question that almost everyone wrestles with at some point when they start digging into world religions. A caller who had recently converted to Christianity poses a really challenging question, one they actually encounter a lot from modern critics. The question is this: if Jesus is supposedly the ultimate embodiment of love, tolerance, and acceptance, why does God maintain such rigid and sometimes seemingly harsh moral, legal, and sexual standards, particularly those found in the Old Testament? It's a fair question, right? In our modern cultural context, where we often equate love with total, unconditional affirmation, does a strict standard of justice essentially override or negate God's love?
To explain exactly how absolute justice and infinite love can perfectly intersect without just canceling each other out, Shamoun crafts this brilliant little courtroom mini-narrative. He tells the caller, imagine a young man who commits a crime. He stands before a judge and he incurs a $500 penalty that he absolutely positively cannot afford to pay. Now, the tension in this courtroom is palpable because the judge sitting on the bench actually happens to be the young man's own father. Because he is a strictly just judge, he can't just ignore the law, wave a magic wand, and dismiss the fine. Justice literally has to be satisfied. But because he is also a deeply loving father, the judge renders the guilty verdict, steps down from the towering bench, physically takes off his judge's robes, and pays that $500 fine right out of his own pocket. The source uses this vivid story to summarize the Christian doctrine of atonement. The idea is that God doesn't lower his standard of justice. Rather, out of infinite love, he condescends in the person of Jesus Christ to pay the insurmountable debt of himself. Furthermore, the source forcefully argues that modern society has fundamentally misunderstood the very definition of divine love. Shamoun asserts that true love isn't merely about condoning all behaviors or providing this endless, blanket tolerance, which, let's be honest, often leads to self-destruction. Instead, he compares God's strict moral laws to a parent taking a young child to a doctor to get a vaccination. The child cries in absolute terror, right? They view that sharp needle as an evil, painful thing, completely unable to comprehend why a supposedly loving parent would allow them to suffer like that. But the parent allows the momentary pain and strictly holds the child still because they know it secures the child's long-term health and ultimate good. According to this study of the source, God's justice operates on this exact same higher ultimate plane of love, seeking humanity's eternal health over temporary comfort. And finally, we arrive at Section 5, the afterlife perspective, eternity and justice. This brings us to what is easily the most emotionally charged and intense topic in our entire study. We hear from a caller who comes from an ultra-Orthodox Hindu family, a man who knows for a fact that his family will likely fiercely reject his new faith. And he asks a deeply agonizing question. He asks how someone could possibly enjoy the paradise and joy of heaven if they possess the conscious knowledge that their beloved earthly parents or siblings have been condemned to hell. I mean, wow. It is a profound, heavy question about the very nature of eternal empathy. You can hear the sheer agony of his predicament right there on the call. He's completely caught between his newfound theological convictions and his deep, abiding love for his earthly family. To answer this heartbreaking question, Shamoun cites the biblical narrative from the Gospel of Luke regarding the rich man and Lazarus, and he paints a striking, almost visceral mental image of the spiritual realm. The story goes that the rich man lives in hedonistic luxury while routinely ignoring the diseased, starving beggar, Lazarus, right at his front gate. When both men die, their physical bodies go into the dirt. Yet the narrative explicitly says angels carry Lazarus away to a place of comfort, while the rich man finds himself in immediate torment. Shamoun emphasizes here that even without physical bodies, these souls retain recognizable spiritual shapes and forms. Across this vast, impassable chasm, they can see each other, they clearly recognize one another, and they experience the immediate consequences of their earthly choices in a very real spiritual dimension, a dimension that involves spiritual flames, thirst, and the desperate need for water. When the tormented rich man begs for just a single drop of water, the patriarch Abraham shows absolutely no remorse, no depression, and no pity over the man's suffering. Abraham shows only perfect justice, basically telling him that he is receiving exactly what he prioritized and chose in his earthly life. Shamoun concludes from this that in the afterlife, a believer's mind, emotions, and will are entirely perfected to see justice exactly as God sees it. Now, this is a shocking concept to modern ears, for sure, but the source asserts that earthly biological ties essentially dissolve in eternity. Quoting Jesus, Shamoun argues that true family is recognized only among those who share a spiritual birth and do the will of God. Therefore, in heaven, one's perspective is supposedly so completely aligned with God's perfect justice and ultimate reality that they simply do not mourn those who willfully rejected the ultimate sacrifice of love. As we wrap up this comprehensive study of the Towards Jesus material, we are definitely left with some profound philosophical inquiries. We've journeyed together from the intricate foundational nature of the triune God through the strict timelines of historical church unity right into intense live debates over Eastern reincarnation, and finally into the staggering, heavy spiritual realities of the afterlife. Whether you personally agree with these orthodox perspectives or you fiercely disagree with the theology presented in these debates, this source material absolutely forces us to confront our own core definitions. So we have to ask, how does your own personal understanding of ultimate justice, divine love, and historical truth fundamentally shape the way you view the universe, the concept of eternity, and your very own place within it all? Thank you so much for joining this study, and keep seeking answers to the big questions.